We now move to the fourth session of this series on conducting literature reviews. And in this session, we look at gap spotting and how we go about advancing knowledge through literature reviews. Now, a key problem with most reviews, we touched upon it briefly in one of the previous sessions, is that they generally end up being too narrative uh, in terms of presenting, say, research profiles uh, and talking about word clouds, figures, and so on. And AMR makes an observation in the 2010 editor's comments where they clearly point out that manuscripts which are mere restatements of present knowledge and do not offer a new conceptual or a theoretical position should not be even submitted. So, as long as you're able to put forth a future research agenda, you find, but otherwise, a mere restatement of what has happened in the past may not really make a literature review very impactful. Now, let's go to gap spotting. When we do a literature review, it's important that we highlight some of the critical gaps that we've found in the extant literature and also offer a motivation for researchers to address these gaps. Now, like we said, it's not just a mere restatement of what has happened, but constructing a plan for future research, which is where you highlight this gap in terms of what we know, what hasn't been studied, and also offer uh, an indication or rather motivate future research so we are able to address these gaps. So how do you go about spotting gaps in the literature, right? Broadly, there are three ways. One is called the confusion spotting, neglect spotting, and application spotting, as per this article from 2011. Now, confusion spotting is where you're finding contradictory evidence, and the main effort here is to call these out in terms of competing explanations in the literature. Neglect spotting is where there's a certain area that hasn't been studied as much, has been overlooked um, despite a wealth of studies. And application spotting is shortage of a particular theory or a perspective uh, in a specific area with the intent that there may be an alternate perspective. Now, here are a few examples, right? You may want to just think about whether there are gaps by themselves. Now, studies have a non-empirical nature, which may actually be fine when we're talking about, say, certain conceptual papers or discussion papers in an area which is very nascent in nature, or even lack of quantitative studies. Uh, the area is probably at a stage where some qualitative studies could lead to some frameworks and conceptual uh, perspectives which could further then materialize as quantitative studies. So lack of quantitative studies may by itself not be a gap, or even non-random sampling in quantitative studies or a lack of theoretical grounding, some atheoretical papers may not be gaps in themselves, but in combination with one another they may actually end up being gaps. But when you highlighting some of these aspects, it's important that you justify these gaps suitably. Now, different contributions of a review. The 2023 Snyder paper actually calls out four types of contributions. The first is evidence of effect, where we are calling out what effects a particular variable may have on another variable y. We will give you some examples in terms of what this really means. Or a second contribution could be mapping out the state of knowledge, where how has research on a particular topic panned out over the last few years, and how is it looked upon in different research traditions and so on. Developing theory is an extremely important aspect, which is why it is highlighted, where you're using prior research to develop theory in terms of building a conceptual and empirical model, and or even theory building, or you're actually trying to extend theory by leveraging past literature, or guiding future research, where you're actually setting an agenda for future research in terms of, say, propositions and research questions that can motivate researchers to explore a particular area further. Now, an example, an illustration for contribution one, evidence of effect. In this paper from 2023 in the Journal of Marketing, the authors actually perform a comprehensive analysis of 5 groups of moderators. And that by itself is an evidence of effect and a contribution of the paper. And that is happening through a meta-analysis. Now, another contribution is mapping out the state of knowledge, where in this article from 2023, they the authors clearly call out that they are unraveling the current state of knowledge on digital sustainable entrepreneurship and identifying themes. So that by itself, in terms of mapping out the state of knowledge, is a contribution. Now, this is a theory development, developing theory, where what they do is to actually provide a conceptual framework which consists of some intervention points for sustainability transitions. And that is a theoretical contribution that the authors make through this paper from 2020. Yet another one is where they look at, they break it down into micro, meso, and macro levels, and they call out the differing theoretical traditions in this paper, or guiding future research, where in this 2016 paper, the authors tabulate the topics and put forth sample questions which can actually set an agenda for future research. So what they do with this table and the overall paper is to actually set a future research agenda. Now, what is a theory when we talk about, say, theoretical contribution, right? Basically, a theory, as the definition goes from this 1990 paper, is that it's a statement of concepts and their interrelationships that show how or why a phenomenon occurs. What does it comprise of? It comprises of constructs, and it also talks about interrelationships. It talks about the relationship between these concepts, that which is actually how the factors are related. And sometimes it typically also introduces causality. And why are the factors related? So justifying these relationships and providing a rationale for these interrelationships is also another aspect of theory. Now, a 2011 paper actually talks about what qualifies as a theoretical contribution. Broadly, it develops a 2 by 2, where when you focus on, say, something like a 3, there is a practical utility here. And in terms of novelty, it's only incremental in nature. Now, this this is a paper which typically ends up getting desk rejected or a firm rejection decision as per the as per the source from which this 2 by 2 is presented, because there is a practical utility but the theoretical contribution is rather not there. Now, when we are talking about, say, 2 or 4, that's where, yes, there is a scientific utility, but the novelty is only incremental. Over here in 4, the novelty is actually there. It's revelatory in nature, but it has a practical utility. So in terms of the scientific utility, it is not there as yet. Now, this is challenging because it requires significant revision if it has to make a theoretical contribution. And thus, that's where it becomes a little dicey in terms of whether this earns a desk rejection or it actually goes in for a significant revision. Now, one is a sweet spot where you actually have scientific utility in terms of making a theoretical contribution, and the novelty is revelatory. So this is where, if it actually has a logical flow and other desirable criteria, this is what actually contributes as a kind of contributes significantly towards theory. Now, through a review, when we're talking about theoretical contribution, you will notice that there are 3 types of theoretical contribution. Now, one of them is in terms of significantly challenging the existing theory. So what they do in this paper from 2007, in Academy of Management Review, is they argue that when we talk about diversity as a construct, it requires to be examined closely, and they peel the layers of diversity. So they call out that there are three distinctive types of diversity: separation, variety, and disparity. Now, that in itself is a theoretical contribution, and they discuss it in detail through this paper. Now, yet another one is where you initiate and search for new theory by identifying and dealing with novel theoretical problems. Now, if you look at this other AMR paper from 1992, they call out that there are some contradictory findings related to the risk on decision making behavior in organizations. Now, what the article does is actually to propose a model that reconciles these contradictions. Now, reconciliation of these contradictions is by itself actually a contribution, a theoretical contribution, and that qualifies as a significant contribution of a paper. Now, yet another one is where you're actually bringing together some of the recent advances and you are proposing fresh theory. Now, in this again AMR paper from 1995, they put together a definition of trust and a model for trust, including its antecedents and outcomes. Now, that qualifies as a theoretical contribution, which is the third type of theoretical contribution. When we talk about contributions, right, in terms of even developing conceptual frameworks, variance and process theories can come in handy. Now, what do we mean by variance theories? Which is where it includes the independent elements and it captures as to how these independent elements lead to variation in some of the DVs, the dependent variables. Process theories, they leverage events and any states to explain any phenomena which are very dynamic in nature. Now, when we talk about, say, contribution, you will leverage some of these to develop propositions that can actually serve as a very actionable uh, aspect for future research. In terms of setting a future research agenda, these propositions can actually be very actionable in nature. And review articles broadly, in terms of creating impactful literature reviews, they focus predominantly on connecting what you've read, making connections between what you've read, and putting together propositions, research questions, and an actionable research agenda for future research. But at the same time, there has to be a logical flow and the rigor must be clear in terms of presenting charts and tables. So it's very clear that you've actually gone through a rigorous process of reviewing the articles and presenting a framework for future research. Now, some examples of propositions. If you look at this, they have proposed a series of propositions in this 2021 article and a theoretical model for understanding, or rather DV being job performance, effect of certain variables on job performance. They propose several propositions here as part of the article. Yet another one where the authors put forth several propositions and put together a framework as well. In this, they actually break it down at a meso, macro, and a micro level, and also call out certain antecedents, boundary conditions, and consequences, and develop several models that could be tested in future research. Now, when we talk about frameworks, right, you will find that there are two important ones. One is a theoretical framework and another one is a conceptual framework. When we talk about theoretical frameworks, it typically takes a deductive approach to a literature review by making use of theories and theoretical frameworks. But conceptual frameworks, it's an inductive approach where it leads to development of a conceptual framework or a model where you're making inferences, as we say, inductive, as it means, making inferences based on an observation, often of a sample, whereas deductive is making inferences based on widely accepted facts or premises. Now, a theoretical framework, it has an anchor on a theory, and that guides the research, whereas conceptual framework uh, is where it may not be the case. You're synthesizing the existing views in the literature, both theoretical and from empirical findings, and you're building this conceptual framework. Here is an example, and the images are predominantly self-explanatory. Theoretical framework in terms of Newton's second law of motion, whereas a conceptual framework in terms of developing it based on what you've synthesized from the literature. Now, there's yet another important one that you need to distinguish between theoretical contributions and theoretical implications. Now, contributions is where you're contributing to the literature. So, if you look at this example from 2013, they call out that there are three contributions. You've delineated an overview of mixed methods research. Um, there are some suggestions in terms of meta inferences being essential components of mixed methods research, and our third contribution is development of an integrative framework. Now, implications in terms of how, what does it imply for future research? So what they say as a theoretical implication is a mixed method approach provides an opportunity for IS researchers. It allows them, it kind of, an implication is for researchers to get engaged in rich theory development processes. That's an implication. And for IS researchers, they will be able to now complement each other and offer unique perspectives. And that's an implication as well. Now, the implications and contributions, it's very important that you typically distinguish between the two and not use them interchangeably when you're talking about contributions and implications as a part of your literature review paper. Yet another example in terms of contributions and implications. What you say is you offer evidence that a field is understudied, disjointed, and you discuss implications not just for theory and research, but also implications for practice and what it means in terms of potential for future theorizing. All right, towards the end of the session, and it's important to go back to the activity. So if you've been doing a literature review already, conducting one, you may want to look at what is the theoretical contribution of your paper, and if you found any contradictions or assumptions that you want to challenge through your review paper based on what you've read in the prior literature, that's another area that you may want to discuss. And as we have always done in the previous sessions, a checklist for self-validation, if you've done this well, is to look at whether you've identified any gaps in the literature that you've reviewed. It's important that you call out certain gaps. Now, did you also go back, take a step back and validate if there are actually gaps? And did you analyze why these gaps have remained unaddressed? Is that an important gap? Is that something that has been overlooked? So on and so forth. And have you been able to leverage some of these gaps and the themes that you've developed to make a significant contribution? Overall, when you've done this, I think you've managed to get to a stage where there is a significant contribution that you've been able to make through your review. All right, so what did we discuss in this session? Firstly, we discussed how we go about identifying gaps in the literature. We looked at different types of gap spotting, confusion spotting, and so on. We looked at whether these gaps are really gaps by themselves and whether we need to discuss them. Do they merit consideration? We also looked at ways by which we could contribute through our review, and we differentiated some of the implications from the theoretical contribution. So what is an implication? What is a contribution? Thank you.